The sterile hum of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in Ward 4, until the heavy steel doors breached with a deafening crack. 5 heavily armed mercenaries poured in, expecting to slaughter helpless casualties. They didn't know the quiet, unassuming rookie nurse changing bandages was a Tier 1 lethal weapon. The forward operating medical facility at Camp Dwyer, nestled deep in a hostile stretch of the Middle East, smelled perpetually of iodine, hot dust, and stale coffee. It was a place where shattered bodies were patched up just enough to survive the long flight to Germany. For Lieutenant Claire Bennett, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to heal others, and in doing so, perhaps heal herself. Claire was the newest addition to the night shift, a fresh-faced Navy Nurse Corps officer who moved with a quiet, almost timid demeanor. She wore her scrubs a size too large, burying an athletic frame, and kept her blonde hair tied back in a messy, unassuming bun. To the combat-hardened patients in Ward 4, she was just the rookie. "Easy with that tape, LT," Corporal Jackson Hayes grumbled, wincing as Claire adjusted the dressing on his shredded calf. Hayes, a 22-year-old Marine from Texas, had survived a secondary IED blast 3 days prior. He was alive, but his patience was dead. "You pull that any tighter, you're going to cut off the circulation I got left." "Sorry, Corporal," Claire said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She loosened the medical tape with practiced, deliberate slowness. "Just ensuring the sterile field is maintained." From the adjacent cot, Sergeant David Miller chuckled. Miller was missing his left arm from the elbow down, courtesy of a mortar shell, but the heavy doses of morphine kept him in high spirits. "Give her a break, Hayes. She's probably fresh out of a cushy stateside hospital. Ain't used to working on ugly, ungrateful grunts like you." Claire offered a polite, nervous smile, dropping her eyes to the clipboard in her hands. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable, Sergeant." "We're Marines, LT," muttered Private First Class Liam O'Connor from the corner bed, his face wrapped in gauze. "We don't do comfortable." They liked to tease her. In their eyes, Claire was soft. She didn't bark orders like the veteran trauma surgeons, and she visibly flinched when the distant thump of artillery echoed across the desert. Whenever a medevac chopper roared overhead, shaking the corrugated tin roof of the hospital, she would freeze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The Marines thought she was terrified of the war zone. They had no idea that her flinch wasn't born of fear, but of deeply ingrained muscle memory. The instinct of an operator calculating rotor wash, infiltration vectors, and landing zone security. Before she was a nurse, Claire Bennett was a phantom. She was one of the first women to quietly pass the grueling trials of BUD/S and be attached to a classified Naval Special Warfare Development Group. For 5 years, she existed only in redacted files, conducting high-stakes direct action raids in the darkest corners of the globe. But a compromised mission in Yemen had left 2 of her teammates dead in her arms. The blood on her hands had become too heavy. She turned in her trident, went to nursing school under a modified identity, and sought redemption in saving lives rather than taking them. But war has a funny way of finding the people who try to leave it behind. The mundane rhythm of the ward was shattered at 2300 hours. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open, and the atmosphere in the hospital instantly shifted. A team of heavily armed, ununiformed men, CIA paramilitary, Claire's trained eye noted instantly, wheeled in a stretcher. On the stretcher was a man thrashing wildly against leather restraints, bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to the chest. He wasn't American. He was older, with a thick beard and eyes wide with panic. Dr. Harrison Cobb, the chief medical officer, rushed out of his office, his face pale. "What is the meaning of this? You can't bring a hostile into a recovery ward." "He's not a hostile anymore, Doc. He's our only ticket to finding a stolen shipment of VX nerve gas," snapped a man in a black polo shirt, flashing a badge that nobody bothered to read. "His name is Tariq Al-Hassan. He's a high-value asset. You keep him breathing until our extraction bird gets here at 0400, or a lot of innocent people are going to die." Claire stood by the nurse's station, organizing vials of saline, but her eyes tracked everything. She noticed the way the CIA operatives positioned themselves at the exits. She noticed the lack of heavy weaponry. They had sidearms and concealed submachine guns, meaning they were traveling light and fast. And she noticed the terrified look in Tariq's eyes. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was bait. They moved Tariq into room 4B, an isolation room at the far end of the hall, directly across from the Marines. 2 operatives planted themselves outside the door. "Looks like we got ourselves a VIP," Hayes whispered from his cot, trying to crane his neck to see. "Keep your head down, Hayes," Miller said, his voice losing its earlier humor. "Spooks rolling in at midnight with a bleeding asset? That puts a massive target on this whole facility." Claire walked over, her face a mask of mild, nurse-like concern. "Try to get some sleep, Marines. They'll be gone by morning." She walked away, but her pulse had slowed to a steady, rhythmic crawl. The familiar, icy calm she hadn't felt in 3 years was beginning to seep back into her veins. By 02:15 hours, the hospital had settled into an uneasy silence. Outside, a freak desert storm had rolled in, battering the reinforced walls of the compound with violent gusts of wind and heavy rain. The rhythmic drumming of water against metal provided a deceptive lullaby. Claire was sitting at the nurse's station, charting patient vitals under the glow of a small desk lamp. Dr. Cobb was asleep in the break room. The 2 CIA operatives were leaning against the wall outside Tariq's room, drinking terrible coffee from styrofoam cups. Then, the lights went out. The hum of the cardiac monitors died, replaced instantly by the piercing, high-pitched shrieks of battery backup alarms. The entire ward plunged into pitch darkness for 5 agonizing seconds before the emergency red lighting kicked in, bathing the corridor in a sinister, bloody glow. "Generators should be kicking over," one of the CIA men muttered, drawing his Glock. "Comms are dead," the other operative said, tapping his earpiece. "I'm getting 0 signal, not even static. We're being jammed." At her desk, Claire didn't gasp. She didn't panic. Her hand smoothly reached down to her pocket and retrieved a heavy pair of stainless steel trauma shears. The rookie nurse persona evaporated into the shadows. Her posture shifted from slouched and submissive to coiled and predatory. Power grid failure coinciding with a localized frequency jammer? That wasn't a storm. That was a synchronized Tier 1 breach tactic. "Stay in your beds," Claire ordered the Marines, her voice suddenly devoid of its usual soft tremor. It was sharp, authoritative, and carried the undeniable weight of command. Hayes and Miller exchanged a confused look in the red light. Thwip, thwip. The distinctive muffled cough of suppressed weaponry echoed from the main entrance of the hospital, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the linoleum floor. The perimeter guards were down. The 2 CIA operatives outside Tariq's room raised their weapons, aiming down the long, red-lit corridor. "Contact front," one shouted. a flashbang grenade rolled around the corner, clinking innocently against the floor tiles. "Cover!" Claire yelled, diving behind the reinforced concrete pillar of the nurse's station just as the grenade detonated. A blinding white flash and a concussive roar ripped through the ward, shattering the remaining glass in the observation windows. Before the ringing in their ears could stop, 4 men in black tactical gear and panoramic night vision goggles swept into the hallway. They moved with terrifying, practiced fluidity, a perfectly executed fatal funnel stack. They were professionals, likely a highly paid private military contractor unit hired by whoever Tariq had betrayed. The CIA operatives fired blindly into the smoke, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Short, controlled bursts from suppressed MP7 submachine guns cut them down in seconds. Both men fell, their blood pooling dark and slick under the emergency lights. In the Marines' ward, panic set in. Hayes, unable to walk, frantically grabbed a heavy metal IV pole, his knuckles white. Miller, with his one good arm, tried to drag himself out of bed to find cover. They were sitting ducks. "They're gonna clear the rooms," Miller hissed, sweat pouring down his face. "Hayes, if they come through that door, you swing that thing for the fences." A heavy combat boot kicked open the door to Ward 4. A lone mercenary stepped in, his weapon raised, sweeping the room. He saw the wounded Marines and sneered behind his balaclava, slowly raising the barrel of his rifle toward Hayes. He never saw the nurse. Claire dropped from the drop-ceiling tiles above the doorway like a striking viper. She had scaled the wall shelving in the seconds after the flashbang. Landing squarely on the mercenary's shoulders, she locked her legs around his neck in a flawless triangle choke, shifting her weight violently to drag him backward. As the massive man stumbled, flailing wildly to throw her off, Claire drove the blunt, heavy tip of her steel trauma shears directly into the brachial artery beneath his collarbone, bypassing his Kevlar plate carrier entirely. The man let out a wet, gargling gasp, his finger jerking away from the trigger. Claire didn't stop. With terrifying efficiency, she wrapped a heavy-duty medical tourniquet around his throat, planting her knee into his spine and wrenching the strap tight. In less than 4 seconds, the mercenary went completely limp. She eased his body to the floor without making a single sound. Hayes and Miller sat frozen in their hospital beds, their mouths hanging wide open. The metal IV pole slipped from Hayes's trembling hand, clattering loudly against the bed frame. The quiet, timid rookie nurse, who was afraid of needles, had just executed a brutal, silent takedown that belonged in a Special Forces textbook. Claire stood up, her scrubs stained with the mercenary's blood. Her eyes, previously warm and nervous, were now cold, calculating, and dead empty. She seamlessly stripped the dead man of his MP7, extra magazines, and a combat knife, checking the weapon's chamber with a rapid, fluid motion. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and picked up the dead man's sidearm. "Lieutenant," Hayes whispered, his voice cracking with shock. "What the hell are you?" Claire didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway, tracking the shadows of the remaining mercenaries moving toward Tariq's room. "I'm your nurse, Corporal," Claire said smoothly, clicking the safety off her weapon. "And right now, it's my job to make sure you boys stay alive." The hallway of the medical compound was bathed in the harsh, rotating crimson of the emergency backup lights. The smell of copper, ozone, and burnt cordite hung heavy in the air, masking the usual scent of sterile iodine. Claire pressed her back against the cool cinderblock wall just outside Ward 4, the stolen MP7 submachine gun held tight to her chest in a flawless high-ready stance. Inside the ward, Corporal Hayes and Sergeant Miller sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide in the dark. The rookie was gone. In her place was a phantom, an apex predator moving with a terrifying silent grace that made a mockery of their earlier teasing. Claire closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out the shrieking medical alarms and the violent drumming of the desert storm against the roof. She isolated the sounds that mattered. One set of heavy boots moving left toward the break room. Two sets of boots holding static near the end of the hall, outside Tariq's isolation room. A radio crackling. They were disciplined. They weren't rushing. They were clearing the sectors. The mercenary heading for the break room was the immediate liability. If he found Dr. Cobb, he'd have a hostage, and the entire tactical geometry of the hospital would collapse. Claire moved. She didn't run, she glided. Her soft-soled nursing clogs, usually a source of comfort for 12-hour shifts, now served as the perfect stealth footwear on the polished linoleum. She reached the threshold of the break room just as the mercenary kicked the door open. Inside, Dr. Cobb let out a muffled yelp, diving behind a plastic folding table. "Clear!" the mercenary barked, sweeping the room with his rifle's laser sight. Claire didn't give him a second to process the cowering doctor. She stepped into the doorway, her footwork perfectly balanced, and brought the MP7 up. She didn't fire. The noise, even suppressed, would alert the two men down the hall. Instead, she closed the distance in two lightning-fast strides. As the mercenary spun toward the movement, Claire ducked under the barrel of his rifle. She drove the palm of her left hand upward, smashing the base of his chin and snapping his head back with a sickening crunch. Before he could fall, she pivoted, wrapping her arm around his neck and driving the pommel of her stolen combat knife into the nerve cluster behind his ear. The man went out like a light, collapsing into Claire's arms. She lowered him silently to the floor, panting softly. Dr. Cobb peeked over the edge of the folding table, his face devoid of color. He looked at the dead mercenary, then up at his newest, quietest nurse, who was currently wiping a smear of blood off her cheek with the back of a surgical gloved hand. "Lieutenant Bennett," Dr. Cobb whispered, his voice trembling so hard it cracked. What is happening?" "Lock this door, doctor," Claire whispered back, her voice devoid of emotion, operating on pure, cold adrenaline. "Stack the chairs against it. Do not open it for anyone unless they speak the day's countersign. Do you remember it?" No, I'm a surgeon, not a soldier." "The countersign is rainfall," Claire said firmly, locking eyes with him to anchor his panic. "If they don't say it, you hide. Understand?" Cobb nodded frantically. Claire slipped back out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her. Down the corridor, the radio clipped to her stolen tactical vest crackled to life. It was the mercenary leader. "Bravo 2, status on the perimeter. Bravo 3, secure the dock. We're breaching the target room now." Claire unclipped the radio, pressing the transmit button. She didn't speak. She just keyed the mic twice. Click, click. Silence echoed on the other end of the frequency. The leader was a professional. He knew instantly what 2 clicks meant. It meant his man was down, and their communications were compromised. "Contact in the corridor," the leader's voice hissed over the radio, the false calm breaking slightly. "Bravo 4, watch our 6. We're blowing the door to 4B. Claire knew she had less than 10 seconds before Tariq was dead or extracted. She couldn't take them both in a straight firefight down a long, open hallway. She had no body armor, just thin cotton scrubs. She needed to change the environment. She backed into the main supply closet. Her eyes scanned the shelves, calculating, adapting. She grabbed 2 large, heavy cylinders of compressed medical oxygen. She rolled them out into the hallway, laying them flat on the linoleum. With a sharp twist, she snapped the regulator valves off both tanks. High-pressure oxygen began violently hissing into the confined corridor, creating a blinding, chaotic plume of white vapor. "Movement in the smoke!" yelled Bravo 4, the mercenary guarding the intersection. He raised his rifle, firing a blind, 3-round burst into the vapor cloud. The bullet sparked against the linoleum. That was all Claire needed. The distraction was set. While Bravo 4 was focused on the hissing tanks in the center of the hall, Claire had already slipped into the adjacent empty patient room. She moved to the drywall partition, separating the rooms. Hospitals and forward operating bases were built cheap and fast. She raised her boot and delivered a devastating piston-like mule kick to the drywall. The cheap plaster shattered. Claire stepped through the hole, bypassing the hallway entirely, and emerged directly behind Bravo 4. He spun around at the noise of the breaking wall, his eyes wide behind his night vision goggles. But Claire was already inside his guard. She brought the MP7 up in a tight center axis relock stance and squeezed the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip. 3 suppressed rounds caught the mercenary center mass, driving him backward into the wall. He slid to the floor, leaving a thick smear of crimson on the white paint. 1 left. A deafening explosion rocked the corridor. The mercenary leader had placed a breaching charge on Tariq's reinforced isolation door. The steel door blew off its hinges, crashing into the room with a cloud of thick, choking dust. Claire stepped over Bravo 4's body, her weapon raised, and moved into the smoke. Inside room 4B, Tariq al-Hassan was screaming. The captured asset was still strapped to his hospital bed, thrashing wildly against the leather restraints as the mercenary leader, a massive man clad in heavy tactical armor, stepped through the ruined doorway. The leader, callsign Croft, didn't waste time. He grabbed Tariq by the collar of his hospital gown, pressing the barrel of a heavy .45 caliber pistol to the terrified man's temple. "Where is the shipping manifest?" Croft roared over the howling wind outside. "Give me the coordinates of the VX, or I'll scatter your brains across this monitor." "Drop it." Croft froze. The voice behind him wasn't the deep, aggressive bark of a Marine guard. It was calm, steady, and terrifyingly cold. It was the voice of a woman. Croft slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway, framed by the red emergency lights and the swirling oxygen vapor of the hallway, was a blonde woman in blood-soaked nursing scrubs. She had an MP7 leveled perfectly at the gap between his helmet and his ballistic collar. For a second, Croft's brain short-circuited. He looked at her oversized scrubs, the messy bun, the hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket. Then he looked at her eyes. They were the eyes of an apex predator. They were the eyes of a Tier 1 operator. "Who the hell are you?" Croft sneered, tightening his grip on Tariq. "You're no nurse." "I'm the night shift," Claire said softly, "and visiting hours are over. Let him go." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He pulled Tariq up, using the bound man as a human shield. "You shoot me, you shoot the asset. You think I don't know the rules of engagement, sweetheart? Drop the weapon, or I put a bullet in his head, and then I take my time with you." Claire didn't blink. She didn't negotiate. Her SEAL training had taught her that hesitation got hostages killed. She analyzed the target. Croft was heavily armored. His chest, back, and head were protected. But in pulling Tariq up, he had exposed his right shoulder, the arm holding the pistol. Claire exhaled, letting her breath out in a slow, controlled hiss. She squeezed the trigger. She didn't aim for Croft. She aimed for Tariq. The suppressed MP7 coughed a single round. The bullet struck Tariq perfectly in the fleshy, non-lethal outer deltoid of his left shoulder. It punched clean through the muscle, a through and through, and buried itself directly into Croft's exposed bicep behind him. Tariq screamed in pain, but Croft roared in agony. The heavy .45 caliber pistol slipped from Croft's suddenly useless fingers, clattering to the floor. Before Croft could recover, Claire dropped the empty MP7 and sprinted across the room. Croft, enraged and operating on adrenaline, swung his massive left arm in a wild backhand, catching Claire in the ribs. The impact was like getting hit by a truck. Claire was thrown backward, crashing violently into a rolling medical cart. Vials of medicine, syringes, and a heavy metal defibrillator crashed down around her. Pain flared in her side, definitely a cracked rib. Croft drew a heavy combat knife with his left hand, stepping over Tariq's bed, his eyes wild with fury. "I'm going to carve you up." Claire scrambled to her feet, her breathing ragged. She didn't reach for her own knife. Instead, her hands grabbed the heavy red paddles of the defibrillator that had fallen off the cart. Croft lunged, driving the knife toward her chest. Claire sidestepped the brutal thrust with inches to spare. She slammed her foot down on the defibrillator's base unit, hitting the manual override charge. The machine whined instantly. With Croft off balance from his missed stab, Claire lunged forward. She slammed both heavy metal paddles directly onto the exposed skin of Croft's neck, right over his carotid arteries. Clear. 200 joules of electricity arched through the mercenary leader's nervous system. Croft's body went completely rigid. His eyes rolled back into his head, his muscles locking in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. The knife dropped from his hand. Claire held the paddles down for 3 agonizing seconds until the machine beeped, resetting. Croft collapsed backward like a felled redwood, hitting the linoleum with a heavy, final thud. He didn't move. Claire stood over him, dropping the paddles. The room was silent except for Tariq's whimpering and the pounding rain outside. She pressed 2 fingers to Croft's neck. A pulse, but faint. He was out cold. She turned to Tariq, who was staring at her as if she were a demon. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a sterile gauze pad, and slapped it over the bullet hole in his shoulder. "Keep pressure on that," she ordered, her tone shifting seamlessly back to a clinical, professional register. Suddenly, the hospital was flooded with blinding white light. The generators had finally been fully repaired. The deafening thwack, thwack, thwack of Apache helicopters shook the roof. The quick reaction force had arrived. Within minutes, the corridors were flooded with heavily armed Marines in full combat gear. They swept the hospital, weapons raised, shouting clear codes. A squad of Marines burst into Ward 4, sweeping their rifles across the room. They froze at the sight before them. The heavy steel doors were blown out. The walls were riddled with bullets. 3 dead mercenaries lay in pools of blood in the hallway. And sitting calmly in the center of the ward was Lieutenant Claire Bennett. She was holding a roll of medical tape, gently resecuring the IV line into Corporal Hayes's arm. Her scrubs were torn and soaked in blood. A nasty bruise was already forming on her cheekbone, and she was favoring her left side. But her hands were perfectly steady. A heavily armed Marine captain lowered his rifle, staring at the carnage in the hallway, then looking at the quiet, unassuming blonde nurse. "Lieutenant," the captain breathed, utterly bewildered. What happened here? Where is the enemy?" Claire finished taping the IV, giving it a gentle pat. She stood up, smoothing down her ruined scrubs, and offered the captain a polite, nervous smile. "They had a little accident, Captain," Claire said softly, her voice carrying that familiar, timid tremor. She looked down at Hayes, who was staring at her with a mixture of absolute terror and profound reverence. "Isn't that right, Corporal?" Hayes swallowed hard, glancing at the dead men in the hall, then back to his nurse. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "They slipped." Miller, from his bed, managed a weak, awestruck chuckle. "Remind me never to complain about the food again, LT." An hour later, a man in a crisp suit, a senior CIA handler, walked into the ward. He surveyed the tactical destruction, the precision kills, the flawless execution of close-quarters combat. He stopped in front of Claire, who was sitting at the nurse's station, sipping a fresh cup of coffee and icing her ribs. The suit looked at her name badge, then down at the way she held her pen, ready to strike, not to write. He recognized the ghost sitting in front of him. "Lieutenant Bennett," the suit said quietly, ensuring the Marines couldn't hear. "Or should I use your previous rank? The agency owes you a debt tonight." Claire took a sip of her coffee, her eyes dropping back to her patient charts. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I'm just a nurse." She didn't look up, but her voice carried a quiet, undeniable finality. "And my shift isn't over." The handler nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his face, and walked away. The phantom of Ward 4 had returned to the shadows, hidden perfectly in plain sight. If this heart-pounding story of a Navy SEAL hiding in plain sight kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible tale of real-life military heroism. Drop a comment down below right now. Would you have ever guessed the quiet rookie nurse's truly deadly secret?